Well, welcome and good afternoon. Pnawn da a chroeso. Thank you for joining us for today's Nesta Talks 2 event. Nesta is the UK's innovation is to use our unique combined skill set to create innovative solutions to address some of the biggest challenges that we face today. Our strategy at Nesta between now and 2030 is based on 3 missions. A healthy life, focusing on the challenges of obesity and loneliness. A sustainable future, focusing on reducing household carbon emissions. And a fairer start. Our focus on a fairer start is on narrowing out impact practices including growing up on the early. Let's get started our conversation with our series with today's speakers. My name is Helen Wales, and I'm the fairer start Wales. And we are really pleased to welcome Graham Donaldson. How we build an education system that is quality and about not to. We're also really pleased to welcome Helen Wales. I know we're doing like people from Wales, Scotland, England, and much further afield. On the list of Argentina, Australia, Netherlands, and people from the so please make this as much as other conversations. So please do join the conversation in the comments box on the right-hand side of the screen. Share your thoughts and ask your questions throughout the event. Closed captions can also be accessed via the LinkedIn live stream. So Professor Graham Donaldson, our guest today, has spent over 40 years in education and has worked in schools, universities, local and central government. He is no stranger to change and innovation in education. A qualified teacher of history and social science, he taught and occupied senior positions in Scotland, including leading the Inspectorate of Education and playing an influential role in the development of the Curriculum for Excellence, particularly in relation to teacher education with the report Teaching Scotland's Future. In 2015, his report Successful Futures, the review of the curriculum and assessment arrangements, was published in Wales, paving the way for major curriculum and education reform here. He works as an international expert for the OECD, advises governments and NGOs, and is a professor in the Robert Owen Centre for Educational Change at the University of Glasgow. So welcome, Professor Donaldson. Hi.
Hello.
Great. Yeah, thanks for joining us. So we thought the best place to start would be with what's going on here in Wales. It's 7 years since Successful Futures was published. In September, we're seeing the first rollout of the new curriculum for Wales. Where are we really, and how did we get here? Let's set the scene.
Okay, well, to provide the context for what's happening in Wales, and going a little bit further back. I mean, you mentioned kindly my very lengthy service in education over 40 plus years, and it's interesting over that period, if I reflect on it, the kind of waves that have taken place in terms of how we've thought about the curriculum, how we've thought about the nature of the relationship between what happens in schools and what happens in the policy process. So when I first started, it was very much a free-for-all. As a teacher, on my first day in school, I was just told to get on with it, and I had huge freedom in a secondary school at that time. We then moved into a phase from the mid-1970s onwards where there was concern about the secret garden, that in a sense politicians lost faith in the teaching profession as being the driver of economic development in the country particularly. And that led to the national curriculum and all that followed throughout the 80s and 90s. We then moved into a period where new public sector management, focus on effectiveness, focus on outcomes, was very much in the vogue in terms of thinking about educational change. But more recently, and that, since about 2010 onwards, a major debate has been taking place internationally about why do kids go to school? What are schools for? What should be the relationship between the nature of the curriculum and the broader policy context within which education is formed? So back in 2014, I got a conversation, a phone call from the Welsh government that asked me to come and have a chat with them about what they perceive to be an increasing set of issues around their national curriculum and assessment arrangements. The pressures on the core were building, and they were trying to reconcile increasing pressures with a fairly tightly defined national curriculum. So I agreed to undertake a radical review. It wasn't a kind of tinkering review. If the agreement with ministers was it would be as radical as it needed to be based on what I found. And out of that came the report Successful Futures. And what I found in Wales during the preparation for that report, and I toured Wales, north, south, east, and west, and visited many schools, talked to hundreds, if not thousands, of children and teachers. And what was very clear was that there was a loss of confidence in the teaching profession in Wales. They were almost apologetic about what they were doing for the young people, feeling it wasn't really what they wanted to do, but it's what they had to do. And I asked a very open-ended question. I said, well, take away all the pressures on you and answer me this question. Wouldn't it be great if? Now, what would that be? And out of that grew Successful Futures, of course, also taking account of research evidence and international practice. But out of that grew Successful Futures, which made 67 recommendations, and following consultation, they were accepted in full. But drawing on my experience, having been asked to undertake the review, about half of the recommendations related to curriculum assessment, and the other half related to professional learning, to leadership, to accountability. In other words, if you're going to change the curriculum, you have to set the context for that in terms of the implications for all of those other things, that ecosystem that is the education system. And that's partly based on my experience in Scotland, because I think in Scotland, which was right in the vanguard of thinking differently about the curriculum, from the early part of this century. But I think in Scotland, we made too many assumptions that the rest of the system could just do it, and didn't invest enough in developing our teachers, invest enough in thinking about the relationship between accountability and what actually happens in school. So that was a lead up to Successful Futures and the reform programme, which has been underway now for the last 5 years, leading to the intention to have implementation from next session in primaries, is where we are now.
Thanks. In a nutshell, thanks for that run through, Graham. I think there's so much in there that I think we're going to pick up through the course of this conversation. I think one thing that's really important to drive home is, I often find that when we talk about curriculum reform in Wales, people who aren't in the thick of it just don't get what we're talking about, in terms of they think we're tweaking a syllabus. They don't appreciate the magnitude of the reform process that's going on. And what we're actually talking about is whole-scale system change. And I guess the stage we're at now is that shift from vision and thinking into the real implementation, with all those players and stakeholders going on that journey and about to make this real. What are the big challenges in your experience from moving into that implementation stage? And are there particular things that we need to be wary of?
Yeah, given the scale of the reform in Wales, and the fact that the Welsh government have placed huge faith in the teaching profession in Wales. And I think that's interesting. A lot of curriculum reform kind of assumes that teachers have to be, dragged along behind a reform, that they have to be driven to reform. What has happened in Wales is that the teaching profession and the wider community, but particularly the teaching profession, has been right at the centre of shaping this new curriculum, and now trying to make it a reality in our schools. So one of the challenges, undoubtedly, in any reform is legacy, is what's the default position. And when you add to that the experience of the last couple of years with the pandemic, one of the big questions I had in my head was, given everything that had happened over the 2 years, given all the pressures that have been on teachers and young people and their parents, would Wales still be up for reform? Or would they say, well, that would have been nice, but just let's get back to the familiar, and let's do what we know we can do, or think we can do. The surprising thing was that doesn't seem to have been the case. The new minister in Wales, Jeremy Miles, has gone on record as saying, as a new minister, he quite rightly would ask lots of questions about what he was inheriting, and I think he was surprised probably at the extent to which there was a desire to continue. So the biggest single issue, if you like, in radical reform is actually to sustain it, and to see it as a long-term endeavor, not something that happens as a one-off, and therefore keeping refreshing why you're doing it, keeping talking about why the reform matters, what it is we're trying to achieve for young people, why this is going to be better for young people, keeping reminding people of that. Because once you get involved in reform, the tendency is for it to become very technical, that we get into the minutiae or the mechanics of the process, and that becomes the purpose, to get the mechanics right. But we need constantly to remember why we're doing it in the first place. And that's the biggest single challenge, I think, is not to lose the narrative, not to lose the sense of purpose that led to the original reform, especially where you have quite an elongated period during which the reforms are being prepared and then put into practice. From the publication of Successful Futures in 2015 to secondaries, young people in secondaries moving into qualification will have a decade in which that process has taken place. Sustaining belief in the reform and the willingness, and not to lose the original purpose, is the biggest single challenge, I think, in the reform process. Add to that the implications for the teaching profession in terms of professional learning, and that's not training. That's not saying, here are some new things we expect you to do, we're going to train you to do them. That's saying, because the reform is giving more agency to the teaching profession, the professional learning is about capacity building. It's about helping teachers to understand the nature of the reform. It's about ensuring that the professional learning process doesn't become simply an instrumental training process, that retains that capacity building. And the other element, critical element, is accountability.
I think I'd really like to touch on all those things: professional learning, the vision behind it, and accountability. But perhaps if we start with the professional learning side, because I think one thing that's really striking is how trust in teachers is really at the heart of reform. You might say it's a reimagining of the role of the teacher, or actually the reinstating of the role of the teacher from a curriculum deliverer to a curriculum developer. But with that trust comes responsibility, comes actually perhaps anxiety as well, and whether or not people feel prepared to deliver what you may say is a new role for them as teachers. So how do we strike that balance between independence and guidance, between local decision making, which is at the heart of the curriculum, and that sort of central oversight?
Yeah, and that's been a feature of the process in Wales throughout. I mean, the fact that there were something around 200 so-called pioneer schools That was schools that opted into the process of helping to create this new curriculum. Now, normally, when you reach this stage in a reform, you've got a small core at the centre, and you've got everyone else, and you then have the challenge of how do you move from this what the core had decided was the right thing to do, to bring everybody into the tent and everybody wanting to be part of the process. In Wales, you've got 200 pioneer schools across the country. So wherever you are in Wales, you're not too far away from a school that actually has been involved in shaping this curriculum. So that's a head start in terms of the whole process of trying to engage people in the process. There also has had to be a kind of self-denying ordinance by the Welsh government, because the legislation that has gone through deliberately pulls back from very tight specification, very tight instructions to schools about what the school curriculum should be, and that was I know that was a very key set of discussions which took place. Is how much do you put in statute? Because once something's in statute, it's very hard to change. You become locked into the point in time. And one of the things that I was certainly keen on was that this new curriculum for Wales shouldn't be the 2018 curriculum. So that in 2025 or 2030, you're still referring back to the 2018 curriculum because it's tightly defined in statute. So that the nature of the strategic direction which the statute sets is deliberately one which focuses on the purposes, focuses on the big bits of the architecture, but doesn't get down into being too specific about the detail, to allow this to be something that is agile, organic, that can grow and develop, and which allows individual communities, individual schools, that the curriculum to strike that balance between not having an atomistic education system where every school's different from each other. So there's enough commonality coming through the strategic framework, but huge scope for schools to then interpret and define that in ways that are in the best interests of their children and young people. And that's what Wales has been trying to do. We're not at a stage where we know how well that's actually worked. This is work in progress. I'm not naive enough to believe that, throughout every school in Wales, every teacher is just thirsting to get on with this new curriculum. So there's a big job to be done in terms of continuing to inspire, creating a critical mass, but in professional learning terms, being sure that the networks are there, that the sources of support and help. So as I said earlier, it's not a training process, but it's one where teachers can help teachers, both inside a school and across schools, that the consortia in Wales can play a critical role in terms of facilitating this and helping to build the capacity in the system. So we're at that point in Wales where that process is underway. They've got a national approach to professional learning, which has been developed. It's now in progress. It's stuttered because of the pandemic. That's inevitable. We're coming out of that now and trying to re-engage and re-energize the process. But as I say, because there appears to be a sufficient willingness to continue with the reform, that's quite an optimistic place to be in terms of the likelihood of this actually bearing fruit as we move forward.
I mean, we did hear this week that half of secondary schools have opted to delay the implementation of the new curriculum. Is that something that you think we should be worried about?
No, I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable to be cautious about the new curriculum. And in secondaries in particular, a key question will be the shape of national qualifications. How far will the way in which the curriculum is developed be a good preparation for that culmination in terms of qualifications through GCSE and beyond. And therefore, there's a school by school decision, I think, about how ready you are. What's your anticipation of the qualifications? So I don't think. I mean, I think that is actually quite a mature situation to be in, with those schools that feel, yeah, we can do this. want to get ahead, we really want to get on with this, and there's a lot of them, can do so. But you're not forcing schools that might otherwise be pretty sceptical or worried about the reform. You're not forcing them in too early. What I have recommended is that secondaries, that even though they decide to delay, they ought to focus on transition. They ought to focus very much on that relationship between the primary experience and the secondary experience, and try to ensure that what we don't have is the primaries forging ahead and developing their approach to the curriculum, which when the secondaries come in is then a fait accompli. So it's very hard to create what was the original intention, this clear line of sight, this smooth progression as young people move through the various phases in their educational experience. So even if you're delaying as a secondary, my strong belief is you ought to focus on transitions. Don't delay by ignoring, but delay by putting your effort into that end of the development process.
Yeah, I think it is sort of another lesson in how a system like an education system really can move as one and move as a whole when it's changing. I mean, Scotland is, obviously it's not been exactly the same process and the curriculum is different, but there are a lot of similarities. Are there particular things that we should be learning in Wales, particularly in relation to what good professional development looks like in this new kind of curriculum?
Yes, as I said earlier, I think, as I said, Scotland was very much in the vanguard of what is now not a universal, but internationally, an increasing development in terms of thinking about the curriculum, not simply as a transmission of knowledge, not simply as the acquisition of learning, but about the whole building of young people. So it's not simply what they've learned, but what they become as a result of the learning. It's how we can help them to develop in order that they can cope with a very like what already is, but likely a very febrile kind of environment in which they are going to live, so they can thrive in that environment. So Scotland was early in the field in that it's for capacities, focusing on curriculum, the building of capacities, rather than simply defining a syllabus or defining the subjects to be covered and the content to be learned. But as I said at the outset, I think we probably underestimated just how big a shift that was. And one of the issues in Scotland was about whether we'd invested enough in building the capacity of the teaching profession, understanding just how big the challenge was for the teaching profession. And that was actually the reason you made reference to a piece of work that I was asked to undertake just after I retired from the inspectorate. Because previously I had been talking to ministers about this. What we were getting back through the inspection process was a lot of commitment to the principles of curriculum for excellence, a lot of belief that this was the right thing to do, but quite a lot of variation in terms of how confident people were to actually be able to engage and realise in full the opportunities. That's what led to Teaching Scotland's Future, which was the report that I undertook, which really made recommendations which were designed to move from teacher training to teacher education, to build capacity in the system, to try to get the university sector much more directly involved, not just in preparing new teachers, but throughout the process of a professional career, moving towards a master's level profession and having that as an integral part of how a teacher would grow and develop would be career-long professional learning that would, where appropriate, would involve the universities. And interestingly, in Scotland there was a review done of Teaching Scotland's Future, commissioned in 2015. The things it found was that the dramatic difference in how to teach it, what previously was in-service training. The notion that a teacher was much more intimately involved in taking responsibility for their own professional development, and the school and the employers had the corresponding of creating the context within which that personal responsibility can be discharged as opportunities there. That was reinforced by the work of the General Teaching Council, which revised its standards, this whole business about professional growth, professional learning. So if we take that forward into Wales, then what we have seen is Professor John Furlong, undertaking a review of teacher education. So huge differences in terms of the way in which teacher education, pre-service education, is conceived and delivered in Wales. We have the development of the All Wales Masters, which I think is an incredibly powerful development, where the universities across Wales have cooperated together to create a single common masters, which can be delivered by different universities, but which has the same kind of, operates within the same frame and relates directly to the educational reform that Wales is engaged in. So you're building capacity, and the universities are much more intimately involved in that process of building capacity. So I think the big lesson from Scotland is about invest in building the capacity of the profession. And I mean, it's almost a no-brainer, isn't it? You know, that's the point at which learning, you know, the interchange between a teacher and a young person, that's the key part of the learning process. So if you invest in that, invest in the teachers who are engaged in that, you're likely to bring about the kind of improvements you're looking for in that at that end of the process.
I'd like to move on to talking about qualifications, which you've referenced already. Qualifications assessment, it's exam season. We're getting the usual stories about exam anxiety. This year, we're hearing that some schools can't, they're struggling to staff their examinations from invigilation. I think one of the challenges with exams, and that I think has been particularly picked up in Scotland, is that they do create a very top-down approach, that they can distort what comes before. And with all the best intentions, people look towards the exams and what comes at the end. How is it possible to create a qualification system that doesn't have that impact? And if not, what is the best way to avoid it?
Yes, I mean, I think we need to recognise that the qualifications do represent the culmination of education for all young people in different forms. It happens at different stages, and therefore it's naive to think if we get the curriculum right, the qualification will just follow. So I think it probably also was an issue in the Scottish context, which Wales, I think, is learning from. And that was we had in Scotland a kind of because we were so concerned that qualifications were driving secondary education right from the start. When a young person enters a secondary school, they had that very powerful backwash effect from qualifications. With the best of intentions, we then said, well, let's develop something, and then think about qualifications. Let them grow out of the curriculum, rather than the other way around, that the curriculum has to serve the qualification. Let's see if we can do that. I think now on reflection, the reality is we need a much more iterative process, that in fact the two needed to be developed much more hand in hand when we came towards secondary education. And in Scotland just now, Professor Louise Hayward is leading a reform, which is asking those very specific questions about just what the question you've just asked is the question which Louise in Scotland and her group, I'm actually working with her on that, is designed to help answer. But in the Welsh context, Qualifications Wales has already been involved in the process of consulting, of talking to colleagues about, can we square this circle? Can we develop a qualifications process which is true to our curriculum purposes, but also serves the fact that qualifications are the tickets that young people need in order to move into the next stage in their life. If they want to go to university, if they want a particular job, if they want to be involved in a business, whatever. So qualifications have got to be Janus-like. They've got to look in two directions, and that's the process that is currently underway in Wales, and which Scotland now, I think, is re-engaging with the catalyst of the pandemic, which has, I think, led us all to realise that the qualifications process, what we saw in the UK in relation to qualifications, and Gordon Stobart has written a very good report on this, is that the UK was less resilient than most other countries. It's called because we're too dependent on examinations. They're all dependent on examinations. As soon as you can't do that, you're then in difficulty. Many other systems have a much closer relationship between what the teachers are developing in relation to their understanding of young people's achievements and external ways of recognizing those achievements that are not simply dependent on sitting down for a couple of hours or 3 hours with a pen and paper. So our system, which is actually relatively unusual, UK-wide, I mean, relatively unusual internationally, has proved has lacked resilience in the face of the pandemic. And I think where we are now is to say, can we produce a way of recognizing young people's achievements more broadly than you can simply do through an examination? That's not to say examinations don't matter or they shouldn't have examinations, but they're a mode of assessment. And we need to develop those modes of assessment that assess and recognize what it is that matters, not saying how we assess has got to define what matters. And so it's just it's asking the question a bit differently. And that in both Scotland and Wales, that process is now helpfully, I think, underway.
I think that there's quite a lot that we've learned from the pandemic around qualifications, aren't I think not least the fact that actually quite a lot of young people did quite like them, and they sort of missed having that end of school, this is where I am assessment. So I think like sort of the education system, the qualification system, as you say, needs to please so many people and is looking in so many different directions. I mean, if we could start from scratch now with qualifications and design something that really grew out of the curriculum for Wales, what would be at the heart of it? What would we be doing?
Well, I think in terms of qualifications, it is that thing I just talked about. It's not saying this is how we assess, and what we want, what matters has got to fit within that. It's asking the question about what modes of assessment are going to be best for the purposes that we are pursuing. Of course, you have to have fairness and reliability, so, and that's a factor which has to be taken into account. All the systems got to balance validity and reliability, and Gordon Stobart talks about dependability, uses the word dependability, that the qualifications have got to be dependable. They've got to be valid in terms of relating to what matters, but they've got to be reliable in the sense that they are fair to all young people that sit there. When of course our current examination system has built in inequity in terms of the nature of how you've been prepared, the nature of the context within which you're able to prepare for examinations, and there's a personality factor too in terms of sometimes gender related in terms of who responds best to that sit down paper and pencil type examination as opposed to more continuous assessment. So I think what we've learned is how flexible can we be to be true to what matters.
I guess the other side of that is if we're trying to develop a learner-driven, a child-centered curriculum, but then we have a learner-driven, child-centered teaching methods, but then we have a one-size-fits-all qualification and assessment system, that's really misaligned with the vision and I guess sort of the rights-based heart of the curriculum that we're trying to put in place.
Yes, and I think that's the challenge. Interestingly, if we go back 40 years or 30 odd years, there was a lot of thinking about this back in the 60s and 70s, and the development by examination bodies of what was called Mode 3, and that was where a school-based curriculum could be externally moderated by an examination body. So that was the reliability bit, but the school had a lot more control over the nature of what was being assessed, not necessarily how it was being assessed, but what was being assessed. So there's quite a lot to draw on there, and I think again it's very difficult for us to not to be overwhelmed by the past. That's how we do it here. And I think the pandemic has, as you say, it has caused us to think about that more carefully, perhaps, than we might otherwise have done. So it's been a catalyst. But the nature of what is going, the nature of the world that is going to develop in the next decade would have driven these changes anyway. It's just, I think the pandemic has had a catalytic effect. And of course, the use of technology in teaching and learning, but also in the assessment process. Understanding how to use that technology to help us do what we want to do, I think will be particularly significant. And again, the pandemic, I think, has probably, for all of us, has led us to lose some of the fear of technology and some of the fear of what if it goes wrong, to understanding actually we can probably make this work, and if it goes wrong, it can be fixed. And I think we now have a teaching profession and a society, but certainly a teaching profession, that's much more confident about technology than was the case 2 or 3 years ago.
I just want to ask one more question on the assessment and accountability theme there, and that's sort of around the move away from national summative and end of phase assessments, and this real commitment that the purpose of assessment is to understand where learners are and to support them in their progress. I mean, like you said, we are really tied to our existing ways of holding the education system to account and our existing methods of assessment. And I think there are people who are really anxious about the fact that we're not going to have these big benchmarking exercises and sort of know these are where this cohort of children and young people are. What's your response to people who have that anxiety?
Well, like most things, there's a trade-off that we've just got to face up to. We have had a period. I mean, the notion of benchmarks and metrics-driven change is relatively recent. I mean, that's the last 20 years really that has been around, and we know from experience that while that gives you information of a kind, it also has a very, very significant backwash effect in terms of the nature of learning. So if you focus on that as being the driver of accountability, then what you tend to get is that process then distorts the way in which assessment is used for learning. So the purpose of assessment becomes all about judgment, rather than the purpose of assessment being to help young people progress and move forward. It moves away from being diagnostic and becomes much more judgmental in the process. And one of the recommendations in Successful Futures was, if there's a tension between assessment for accountability and assessment to help young people learn, assessment to how young people learn should win every time. We need to find other ways of ensuring that we have enough of a handle on how the system is working in order to be confident that we are making progress and to identify where there are problems. But that should not, it's just completely wrong if that then distorts the process and hampers the process of young people's learning. And I think Wales is grappling with this just now and trying to move towards different forms of assessment. For example, at system level, you can do cohort sampling, so you can get a handle on how, whether the system as a whole is moving forward well, without having to test every child, in every school on a very frequent basis. So I think, again, one of our big problems is we tend to polarize everything. So you get summative bad, formative good, or formative good, summative bad. And we do it all the time, as if, knowledge good, skills problematic. We just polarize, we dichotomize things. And the reality is that what we need to do is to think sensibly and rationally about how we draw on all of the experience and knowledge we've got to arrive at a system which is both gives sufficient confidence about the fact that young people are progressing and should, as they should in their learning, but not in a way that leads to the learning process itself being undermined. And an example of that in Wales, I think, Wales introduced a categorization system for schools, a traffic light system, green, orange, red, which was done for good intentions. The intention was as a triage system. So if you were red, that meant you needed lots of support. If you were green, you didn't need as much support. But of course, the backwash effect was that red became a badge of dishonor. So the schools that needed most support were the ones who were trying to hide the fact that they needed the support. So the system of accountability was actually distorting what it was originally intended to do. And we've got all those unintended consequences run through accountability systems. And having been a former head of an inspectorate, I'm acutely aware of the power of an external accountability system to do good or to do harm. And we need to maximize the good and minimize the harm.
I think it's that question, isn't it? As soon as we start ranking and grading, we put in we attach judgment to it, and you use that word sort of judgmental yourself. And I think one of the things that sort of is really interesting about the kind of change and the kind of culture that we're trying to instill is how you create space. I think not necessarily for people to get things wrong, but for things not necessarily to be right first time. I mean, it's a classic innovation question, isn't it? How do we create a system that allows people to keep learning and to build and develop rather than making those judgments that things aren't working? And I think it's particularly hard in education, perhaps particularly in devolved contexts where education is increasingly politicized and is probably going to become so. So how do we keep that space for trying, testing, learning, collaboration, avoiding judgment? And also can we avoid that politicization of education, which can be so crushing?
Like so many things, this is all about culture and leadership. It's about professional leadership. It's about political leadership. And as we've seen in Wales, it's about politicians who are sufficiently brave to give up the illusion of control. And it is an illusion, so you can look strong. You can look as if you're doing dynamic things, but what you're doing is harm. But it doesn't look like that. And in political terms, it can come across as something which it plays well if you present it in the right way. So I think that the where we need to get to is a situation where both professionally and politically we're aligned, so that and that means, I think, that as is happening in Wales, the teaching profession has to be much more intimately involved in the process and the policy process. That doesn't mean say it decides, but it has to be much more intimately involved. We unfortunately all too often end up in a situation where, as a teaching profession, we say what we don't like, but we find it very hard to influence what we do like. And that debate somehow or other happens elsewhere. So I think that the profession needs to become, and has become in Wales, not adversarial, but much more, part of a constructive process, and that requires politicians to be mature enough to be able to engage in that. There's a similar kind of discussion taking place in Scotland just now. There's a report that's just been published that Ken Muir led, which is looking at national infrastructure and looking at this relationship between what happens locally and what happens at the centre, and asking the question that, how much should Holyrood decide and how much should you be leaving? So it's the same kind of debate as we've had in Wales over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. So there isn't a pat answer to this. It does require, I think, it requires a mature discussion that looks strategically, not at the next 2 or 3 years, but looks well ahead and says, if we are going to have an education system, if our young people are going to experience the kind of quality of education which they deserve. And the standards are going to rise, but we need to define standards in relation to what really matters, not just what we measure. So standards rising, quality of experience going forward, thinking about that in the longer term, and then thinking back from that in terms of what are the conditions, from all that we know, what are the conditions that are most likely to lead to that, and how do we have the kind of agility that means that we can, once we embarked on it, we don't just plunge on blindly, but we can make the adjustments. We've got the feedback mechanisms that allow us to make the adjustments. So in terms of your question about risk, we obviously need measured risk. It's not reckless. It's not just I'll do what I fancy. But having been clear about the purpose, having been clear about the values, and actually there's a very interesting quote from Mark Carney, a former governor of the Bank of England, in a book which he wrote around values, which, to paraphrase, said, have we lost what we really value in our drive? Has our vision been so narrow that we've lost what we really value? And that's in talking about economics. I think the same thing can apply in education, that our drive for effectiveness means that you get into a kind of improvement trap where you improve things that are less and less important, and you miss sight of the things that you lose sight of things that really matter. And risk in all of that is about trying to bridge that gap. It's not reckless, but it's about measured risk in order to try and ensure that we are being brave enough to go beyond the safe.
So many things I'd like to ask. I'm aware of time and the questions in the chat, but one thing I'd like to sort of make sure that we do cover is this question of the attainment gap. And I think it's sort of come up in different forms in our conversation so far, the question around examinations and inequity, the questions around what is it that actually matters. I mean, what is at the heart of this gap for you, and how do we really address it? Because it's persistent, it's stubborn, and lots of educational reforms haven't really done that much to help make sure that the education systems, frankly, don't continue to disadvantage people who are disadvantaged.
Of course, a lot of what relates to the attainment gap happens outside the school, doesn't happen.
Well, that's another part of the question, isn't it? Yeah. So
that it's important that schools do all that they can do, but part of that political question that I talked about is the understanding that the nature of what happens outside of school is a critical determinant of young people's capacity to be able to benefit from what the school has to offer. We have. Very helpfully, I think, got an increasingly powerful understanding of the importance of the early years, the importance of those years, including pre-birth. The nature of the conditions that are created for a young person to grow and develop. Because we talk about the attainment gap, but actually the attainment gap is largely a function of the experiential gap. And we need to ensure that we're giving our young people those experiences that fire their imagination, that make them want to engage in learning. You've just got to look at 2, 3, 4-year-olds who are, their thirst for learning is limitless. I know with grandchildren, it tires me out. Their desire to learn, their excitement about learning, their exciting about doing new things. Now, in some families, you can provide lots of stimulus for that, and others, it's much more difficult to do so. So that the expansion of early education and the broader conception of the experiences that we need to provide for all young people as they move through and into the more formal school system, that probably is the single most important thing we could do. We know, by the time a young person reaches the age of 4 or 5, the gap's already there. That's before the school, formal education starts. And in other countries, of course, formal education doesn't start until they're 7 or 8. So there's something about the nature of the excitement and experience. People sometimes talk as if play was something that was the thing is unimportant, but that's how young people learn. That's how they learn is through play, where the stimulus is there for them to do things in their play, which is part of the learning. That's what the very skilled, very, very skilled early education practitioners are so good at, and investing there pays huge dividends.
I'd like to ask you sort of about that in relation to this idea of transitions. And you talked earlier about the importance of secondary school building on year 7. So that's sort of bottom up rather than top down approach that we've talked about in relation to the effect that qualifications can sometimes have. I think one of the biggest transitions for children is that transition into school in the early years. So how do we really support that transition to be positive? And how do we make sure that early education and its role in supporting children where they are now at this point in time is really honoured, rather than falling into that trap of early education becoming a sort of preparation ground for school?
I mean, I think the answer is in your question. I mean, the reality is that it's a wee bit counterintuitive, as a parent. If you see your 4-year-old, sitting down and writing, being taught to write, you can think, wow, that's great. But we know that early experience, whatever advantage that may or may not have, is gone by the time you get, the reach 7 or 8. So that kind of early assumption that formal education is going to give you give them an advantage just isn't there. As I said earlier, and in Wales, that's what the foundation phase, development of the foundation phase, was intended to do. It was intended to provide that much richer understanding of how you create the stimulus and space for experience for young people, which then blurs into what they experience in school. Unfortunately, one of the things that became evident to me in looking at when I did my review was that the good intentions of the foundation phase were being eroded by the testing regime, which took place at 7 and 8. So increasingly, schools were telling me, we're actually having to move to more formal education because they're going to do the tests. And therefore, the foundation phase was gradually, in many cases, was withering. The latter stages of it were withering, and the intention that what we have is something that builds smoothly forward was being undermined. So I think again, it's consistency of understanding the purpose, and it's learning from the rich experience we now have about what actually makes a difference in terms of young people's learning, and providing bridging that experiential gap seems to me to be absolutely critical. We do that, the gap can follow.
It's really interesting that you talk about parental expectations there as well. And I think you talked earlier about the narrative and the vision. And I wonder if we've done enough yet to sort of make those mainstream in the public consciousness. I think we're all very tied to school is what our experiences of school were. And if parents feel that children learning to write at 3 or 4 is a good thing, that's quite a battle for some teachers. So that question of how we take the whole nation along with this vision, I think is really significant. We've had a couple of questions in the chat. Somebody who's from Raw Eye Studios has asked about the inspection framework. How much scope is there in the current inspection framework to allow schools to develop alternative approaches? And I guess that takes us back to that question of accountability. Like how can accountability also give permission and encourage and not just restrict?
Well, again, that's a very pertinent question in relation to Wales. It sounds as if I've been doing nothing but writing reports, but the Welsh Inspectorate invited me to do a review of their inspections in the context of the educational reform in Wales, and I wrote a report for them called a Learning Inspectorate, and that was deliberately had a double edge to it. You know, that obviously inspection is very much about how well are young people learning, but inspection needs to learn. Inspection needs to be about itself, you know, learning as the system develops. So Eston have dropped grades in their evaluation of school, their work with schools. And now going to provide, because what grades did was to, as a former head of an inspectorate, I was acutely conscious that I had this very powerful resource, these very able people, and they were spending so much time working out which side of the line we're going to make this judgment about whether a school's, you know, excellent or good. And so what? So what at the end of the day? It's much more important that resource is used to capture the school and to help the school move forward. So you've got this external force plus the school working together to try to bring about improvement for young people. If there's a problem, you go into a different mode and you can deal with the schools that are letting children down. But the vast majority of schools, that's not the case. So inspection in Wales is changing very dramatically. Pilot inspections have been taking place in the course of the period since the end of lockdown. You know, and the new framework will begin to operate in the new session. But it's trying to provide reports which are much more of a narrative, much more trying to capture the reality. You know, recognizing that responsibility for improvement rests with the school. It doesn't rest with inspectors. So inspectors don't automatically know best, but put the two together, put the external and the internal together, you're much more likely to arrive at something which is a balanced view about you know, the way in which that school might move forward. So there's a lot to learn, I think, from the way in which Eston, the inspectorate in Wales, are reimagining what inspection is for in Wales, and that treats the teaching profession not as people to be bullied into getting better, but as co-professionals you work with in order to collectively serve children as well as possible.
I think what strikes me as just so interesting is that the model for what teaching and learning is in the classroom and the relationship between teacher and child and how learners learn is one that we're seeking to replicate at all levels of the system, that we understand where we are and we go from there. We work collaboratively, we understand our strengths and weaknesses. It's what we see at the school level, but also what you're advocating for within the inspectorate. So that systemic unity is at the heart of the vision again. We've got 1 minute left, but we did have one question in the chat about international examples. And I just wonder if you could give us one international example that you think Scotland, Wales, England even should be looking to learn from as we move forward.
There isn't one. There are lots. I mean, one of the things that I've certainly learned is that you don't look at Finland or Estonia or New Zealand and say, well, we'll just do what they do. There are bits that are happening in different countries. There are insights that you can gain from practice internationally, but you have to be true to your own context. You have to take all of that, absorb it, think about it, and then relate it to the context that you actually work in. So Estonia, which is probably the current poster child in PISA terms, you know, invested very heavily in technology, really seen massive transformation, how they thought about the role of technology in education. Well, there's an important message there, which we need to take. Finland, for a long time, has gone for a master's level profession, invest in your teachers. Well, there's an important message there that we can get it. You know, so so there isn't one, but we do need to learn. It's that process of engaging, networking, learning from colleagues across the world, but being true to ourselves, being true to our own context and what's possible in the context and what our aspirations are for our young people as they move forward. And I think there's some quite exciting things happening in Wales and increasingly again in Scotland.
So look broadly elsewhere, but understand what it is you're trying to do and remain focused on that and your own vision as the message.
Don't. It's not policy copying. It's learning. You can be stimulated by seeing things that happen elsewhere, but that doesn't mean to say you should copy. It's why generally I'm reluctant to talk about best practice, because best practice is very context specific. Best problems is better than best practice.
Thank you. I mean, that's another thing we could have talked about. I think I've got a whole list, and we've maybe got through a third of it. So thank you so much, Graham, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and questions in the chat. We've really enjoyed talking to you, and I know that this is a debate that's going to keep on going, because, as you say, reform is continuous, and education and the responsiveness of education to what is needed for children and young people in the wider world is something that is always got to be at the forefront of our minds. We'll be sending out a short survey. I think the link has already gone into the chat for you. Just if you could give us some feedback on the event, we'd be very grateful. And as a thank you for filling out the survey, you can enter a prize draw to win a £50 bookshop.org voucher. I can see Carl has posted the link there. The next Nesta Talks to event is happening next Thursday, the 26th of May. And we'll be talking to Skeena Rathor about how to harness your climate anxiety. So I'm sure that will be really interesting once again. Thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you once again, diolch yn fawr unwaith eto to Graham. Please keep in touch with us at Nesta about our missions. If there's anything you'd like to know more about our work, feel free to make contact. We'd love to hear from you. But thank you very much and goodbye.